The first discovery sent ripples through the small town of Auburn, Alabama. It was the kind of discovery that would haunt the town for years to come, whispered about in hushed tones, talked about only in secret corners, and eventually buried under layers of time. A group of field workers, all descended from families who had worked the land for generations, stumbled upon something that no one could have expected, an array of abandoned slave cabins hidden deep within the overgrown woods, far from the main plantation house. These cabins, long left to rot in the elements, were not just old ruins, they held something far darker inside them. At first, it was only a strange odor that led them to investigate further. The workers, tasked with cleaning up the property for a potential buyer who had expressed interest in the long-abandoned land, hadn't expected to find anything other than rats or decaying furniture. But what they found instead was much worse. Hidden in the farthest cabin, obscured by the rotting remains of wooden planks and debris, were several babies. White babies. The moment the workers saw them, the terror was instant. The babies were unnaturally calm, their eyes wide and unblinking, as though they were unperturbed by the world around them. The air was thick with the stench of decay, but none of the infants seemed to show signs of distress or discomfort. The first assumption was that these children had been abandoned, perhaps a tragic case of a mother who had left them to die in the wilds of the plantation. But something about the way they were positioned, carefully placed in a strange, almost ritualistic manner, suggested that this was no ordinary case of abandonment. The workers, afraid but compelled to investigate further, discovered that there were more babies. The cabins contained more than a dozen, some wrapped in cloth, others left exposed to the elements, but all eerily untouched by the passage of time. Despite the obvious signs of neglect, there was a chilling stillness about the scene. The children were unnervingly quiet, their bodies too still, as though time had suspended itself within that dark corner of the woods. The workers immediately left the site, panic rising within them as they realized the enormity of what they had uncovered. Within hours, the authorities were called to the scene. The local sheriff, a man hardened by years of working in a town that had seen its fair share of tragedies, arrived with a sense of skepticism. He assumed the story had been exaggerated, a group of confused workers had likely stumbled across some forgotten, tragic remnants of a long-dead family. But as he examined the scene, his doubts quickly faded. The babies, no older than 6 months or a year, seemed to have been left in a way that defied logic. No family would have left their children like this. Not in this manner. Not with such eerie precision. The sheriff, with a growing sense of dread, called for backup. Soon, the quiet town of Auburn was awash with rumors and speculation. Local medical professionals arrived to examine the babies, but the results were equally perplexing. They found that the children, despite being malnourished and abandoned for what appeared to be months, showed no signs of illness. Their development seemed abnormal. One infant's eyes were remarkably large for a child that young, while others displayed physical anomalies that were difficult to explain. This could not have been a natural situation. It was as though the babies had been placed there with some greater purpose. News of the discovery began to spread, and with it came growing unease. As more officials and investigators arrived at the plantation, the town's residents began to murmur about the implications. Auburn had always been a quiet, unassuming place, nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened here. The land itself was rich with history, with deep ties to the South's complicated past. But no one could have prepared for the storm that this discovery would unleash. The plantation, once a symbol of decay and loss, became the epicenter of a dark mystery that would shake the community to its core. The plantation had been abandoned for decades, a relic of a bygone era that few remembered fondly. Once owned by a wealthy family with deep ties to the area's darkest history, the estate had been the site of numerous unspoken horrors, horrors that the community had buried, both literally and figuratively. Its former owners, long deceased, had a reputation for cruelty that was whispered about but rarely discussed. Many claimed that the plantation had been a center of untold suffering, that the land was cursed, its legacy forever stained by the blood of those who had worked there. But those were just rumors, stories passed down through generations of locals who feared the very idea of speaking too much about the past. The plantation had once housed hundreds of enslaved people, forced to work the land under brutal conditions. The family who owned the estate was notorious for their harsh treatment of those they enslaved. But after the Civil War and the end of slavery, the plantation fell into disrepair, its once proud buildings crumbling as the generations that had profited from its labor moved away or died. In the years since, the land had been largely forgotten. Its role in the town's history had become a footnote, something people tried to forget. The plantation was just a part of a landscape now dominated by the nearby woods and fields, a place that no one really wanted to revisit. But now, in the quiet of these ruins, a new darkness had emerged. The babies in the cabins were not just an anomaly, they were an unspoken link to the plantation's past, one that could not be easily ignored. They were a living, breathing testament to something hidden in the shadows, a secret that the land itself seemed to be holding close. As the days passed, the authorities struggled to make sense of the mystery. Rumors began to circulate, and local residents, already uneasy with the idea of investigating the plantation, began to grow fearful. Some said it was the work of ghosts, spirits of the past reaching out from beyond the grave. Others believed it was something far darker, a twisted experiment carried out by the plantation's former owners. The idea that the babies might have been part of something unnatural began to take root, and soon, no one in the town felt safe. Local religious leaders weighed in, suggesting that the discovery was a sign of divine punishment, a warning that something had gone terribly wrong, a judgment on those who had dared to tamper with the natural order. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that no one had any concrete answers. The more the investigators uncovered, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. And as the shadow of the plantation loomed larger over Auburn, the town found itself on the brink of unraveling a secret that had been buried for far too long. It was only the beginning. The discovery of the babies would lead to a slow, relentless descent into the unknown. What had happened here? Who had left them behind? And, most terrifying of all, why? The answers would remain elusive, slipping through the fingers of those who sought them, leaving behind only fear and a growing sense of dread. The plantation where the babies had been discovered had long been a place of mystery, and its dark history was woven into the very fabric of Auburn, Alabama. For generations, the estate had stood on the outskirts of the town, its crumbling walls and overgrown fields a silent testament to a time when it was thriving. But the mansion itself, and the sprawling grounds that surrounded it, held secrets that few were willing to acknowledge. No one spoke openly about the plantation's past, but every local knew the rumors, stories that had been passed down through generations, stories whispered around kitchen tables, shared behind closed doors. The plantation was a relic of a bygone era, a time of wealth and power built on blood, suffering, and unimaginable cruelty. At its peak, the plantation was one of the largest in the region, producing vast amounts of cotton and tobacco. The family who owned it had been among the wealthiest and most influential in Alabama, their names synonymous with luxury and privilege. But with that wealth came a deep connection to the system of slavery that had sustained the plantation for so many years. The owners, like so many other landowners in the South, had relied on the forced labor of enslaved people to work the land. They had wielded their power with ruthless efficiency, showing no mercy to those under their control. However, after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the plantation's fortune began to wane. The family tried to maintain their wealth by diversifying their holdings, but the land grew less productive, and the plantation fell into disrepair. The house, once grand and impressive, became a shadow of its former self. Its walls cracked, its windows shattered, and its once beautiful grounds were overrun with weeds and vines. But the plantation was not abandoned entirely. For decades, it sat in a state of limbo, no longer a thriving estate but not quite a forgotten ruin either. It was a place that seemed to resist time, clinging to the remnants of its former grandeur, but forever tainted by the bloodshed and suffering of the past. There were those in the town who had memories of the plantation in its prime, but they were few and far between. Most of the older generation spoke of the land with a mixture of disdain and fear. They remembered the plantation owners as distant, cold figures, the kind of people who seemed to view their workers as little more than property. But the more they spoke of the family, the more the details began to blur. The stories were inconsistent, filled with contradictions and half-remembered events. Some claimed the family had been involved in dark practices, though no one could say exactly what those practices were. Others said that the owners had been haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered on the plantation, and that the house had been plagued by strange happenings, noises in the night, doors slamming shut on their own, flickering lights. But no one could provide concrete proof of these supernatural events. What was clear, however, was that the plantation had always been surrounded by a sense of foreboding, a feeling that something was amiss, something that could never be explained. As the years passed, the plantation was abandoned, and the town of Auburn moved on. The land was left to rot, its former grandeur a fading memory. People in the town had learned to ignore the whispers, to push aside the uncomfortable knowledge of what had happened there. The plantation had become a symbol of the past, an era that the town was eager to forget. But even though it had been abandoned, the property had never truly been out of mind. Every so often, someone would buy the land with plans to restore it, but none of them ever stayed for long. Something about the place seemed to drive people away. Whether it was the isolation, the eerie silence that surrounded the house, or the oppressive weight of history, the plantation was a place that few were able to endure for long. But when the babies were discovered in the cabins, the quiet veil of forgetfulness was torn away. The discovery was a shocking jolt to the town's collective memory. Suddenly, the plantation's past was no longer something to be ignored. It was something to be confronted. The town's long-standing reluctance to deal with the history of the plantation gave way to a flood of questions. What was the truth behind the plantation's decline? Why had the land been left to rot? And most disturbingly, what had happened to the babies? In the aftermath of the discovery, investigators began to dig into the history of the plantation, searching for clues that might explain how the children had come to be there. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that the plantation's past was not just a collection of random events, but a tightly woven tapestry of secrecy, cruelty, and unexplainable occurrences. One of the first things they discovered was that the family who had owned the estate had not simply been wealthy, but extremely powerful. Their wealth had been built on a foundation of exploitation, with generations of enslaved people working the land for little more than their survival. But there was something more sinister at play. The plantation's original owners were rumored to have been involved in occult practices, rituals that crossed the boundaries between life and death, that sought to control forces beyond the comprehension of ordinary people. The townspeople had long whispered about strange happenings at the plantation, events that defied explanation. Some said that the family had used the land for twisted experiments, using their wealth and power to manipulate the lives of others in ways that no one could understand. The more the investigators uncovered, the more they began to wonder whether the babies found in the cabins were the result of one of these experiments. The theories grew darker as the investigation continued. The plantation's legacy of cruelty seemed to have spilled over into its final days. There were reports of strange rituals being performed on the land, of unholy pacts being made with dark forces. Some even suggested that the babies might have been the product of some sort of hybridization experiment, a twisted attempt to cross the boundaries between human and something else entirely. Whatever the truth was, it was clear that the plantation's history was far from simple, and that the discovery of the babies was only the beginning of something far more terrifying. As the town's residents began to recall their own memories of the plantation, it became clear that the land had always been a place of unease. The trees that surrounded the plantation were gnarled and twisted, their branches seeming to reach out like hands trying to pull people into the darkness. The house itself had a cold, imposing presence, its windows like dark eyes staring out at the world, watching. Those who had worked on the plantation in its final years spoke of strange events, strange disappearances, unexplained accidents, and a growing sense that the land itself was alive, somehow watching, waiting for something. But the most unsettling part of the story was the connection between the babies and the plantation's owners. Had the family been involved in some sort of ritualistic practice that resulted in the births of these strange children? Or had they been used as part of some dark experiment? The investigators found little concrete evidence to support either theory, but the more they dug into the plantation's past, the more it became clear that something unnatural had occurred on that land. The truth, however, remained elusive, slipping through their fingers like sand, leaving only fragments of an unimaginable past. The plantation's legacy, its cursed land, its haunted history, had come back to the surface with the discovery of the babies. The truth of what had happened there, however, seemed destined to remain locked away, buried beneath layers of time and fear. The discovery of the babies sent shockwaves through the town, leaving a deep unease that couldn't be easily shaken. The whispers about the plantation, once relegated to ghost stories and half-remembered tales, suddenly had a terrifying new dimension. For years, the town had kept its distance from the plantation, pretending that the land didn't hold secrets that demanded to be unearthed. Now, those secrets had come to the surface, and no one knew how to respond. Some tried to ignore it, hoping that with time, the mystery would fade, but others couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that something far darker was at play. As the investigation into the abandoned cabins and the strange, silent babies began in earnest, the reactions of the townspeople were mixed, yet unmistakably tense. For many, the discovery was a grotesque reminder of the horrors that had once occurred on that land, an unpleasant echo of a past that should remain buried. They didn't want to talk about the plantation. They didn't want to revisit the uncomfortable truths that were entwined with it. But as more people learned about what had been found, that was no longer an option. Local law enforcement, led by Sheriff Robert Ellis, found themselves overwhelmed by the discovery. Ellis had been born and raised in Auburn, and while he'd seen his fair share of tragedies and crimes, this was different. This wasn't just a case of neglect or an abandoned property, it was a harbinger of something much more unsettling. His initial reaction was one of disbelief. White babies found in slave cabins. The sheer impossibility of the situation paralyzed him at first. He had grown up hearing rumors about the plantation but never believed them. Now, he was forced to confront a nightmare that he couldn't explain away. The sheriff had no choice but to call in more investigators, experts in forensics, anthropology, and even paranormal research. The medical examiner, Dr. Cynthia Shaw, who had worked in Auburn for over 20 years, was initially called in to examine the infant's remains. What she found left her shaken. The babies, despite their emaciated conditions and the obvious signs of long-term neglect, were not physically harmed in any traditional sense. There were no signs of trauma, no obvious cause of death. It was as though they had been left. Left in a way that didn't make sense, and in a place that should never have been used to house anyone, let alone children. What perplexed Dr. Shaw the most was the fact that the infants didn't show typical signs of prolonged exposure to the elements. They were unnervingly well preserved for being abandoned in a decaying cabin for so long. The fact that they had been left in the cabins was disturbing enough, but the way in which they were found raised even more questions. Some babies were lying in strange, almost symmetrical patterns, as if they had been carefully arranged. Others were nestled together, their bodies pressed against one another, as though someone had placed them for comfort. These small details, while subtle, hinted at a deliberate act, not one born out of desperation, but something more intentional. And the chilling part was that the authorities had no one to speak to about what had happened. There were no surviving family members, no one with any explanation as to why these babies had been left there. No one had a clear answer, not even those closest to the plantation. As news spread, the community's reaction began to shift from confusion to outright fear. People started talking about the plantation again, but the tone had changed. It wasn't just a piece of land with a dark past anymore, it was a place to be feared, a cursed ground where unspeakable acts had been carried out. The town's elders, those who had grown up with the stories, began speaking of things they had only hinted at before, the rituals, the strange occurrences, the feeling that something in the plantation's history had always been off. The children, it seemed, had unearthed those buried fears. The discovery had reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Some people tried to rationalize what had happened, falling back on the belief that there was a logical explanation for everything. Maybe the children had been abandoned by their parents, orphaned by a tragedy, or maybe they were part of some twisted social experiment. Others, however, were far less optimistic. They believed the babies were the product of something far darker, a legacy of the plantation's former owners, a family that had long been rumored to dabble in the occult. The plantation's history was murky, with few people willing to speak about it in detail. Those who had worked there during its heyday had either passed away or refused to talk about the past. Yet, stories of the family that owned the estate had survived, whispered in the shadows of the town. They were known for their wealth and influence, but also for their strange practices. The rumors painted them as a family obsessed with power, willing to do whatever it took to maintain control over both the land and the people who worked it. There were tales of bizarre rituals, whispered conversations about pacts with dark forces, and the unsettling belief that the plantation itself was cursed. Some even claimed that the family had been involved in necromantic rites, trying to unlock the mysteries of life and death through occult practices. In the months following the discovery, a sense of collective dread settled over the town. No one felt safe. People stopped walking past the plantation at night, and those who had business near the estate made sure to complete it before dusk. Parents warned their children to stay far away from the woods, as if the trees themselves were listening, waiting for something. The feeling of isolation, once familiar to the townspeople, now seemed suffocating, as if the past was creeping back to claim its due. And still, the questions about the babies remained unanswered. How had they come to be there? Who had placed them in the cabins? And perhaps most chilling of all, why? As the investigation continued, the theories grew wilder. Some speculated that the plantation's previous owners had been involved in some kind of dark alchemical experiment. Perhaps the babies were the product of these twisted rituals, created for a purpose no one could comprehend. Others believed that the children were a form of reincarnation, cursed souls who had been sent back to the land to seek redemption. There was no shortage of explanations, but none that could account for the eerie calmness of the infants or the strange, deliberate way they had been left behind. In the town of Auburn, the lines between belief and skepticism began to blur. The rational minds in the town, those who refused to believe in anything beyond the scientific, tried to dismiss the idea that something supernatural was at play. But the more the investigation uncovered, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that the plantation's dark legacy was far more than just a collection of bad memories and rumors. Something malevolent seemed to linger on the land, watching from the shadows. The babies were not simply the result of human cruelty or neglect, they seemed to be part of something far larger, something that defied logic, reason, and even science. The town's residents, gripped by fear and uncertainty, began to retreat into themselves, their conversations growing quieter and more strained. The discovery of the babies had not only reawakened the past but had fractured the sense of safety that had once held the town together. The plantation, once a distant relic, now loomed over their lives, casting a shadow that seemed impossible to escape. The mystery of the babies had only deepened, and with it, the terrifying possibility that the land held secrets that no one could ever fully understand. As the days passed, it became clear that the investigation was not going to provide answers. Those involved in the case, once determined to uncover the truth, were now stumbling in the dark, unsure of where to go next. The babies, with their unnatural silence and eerie stillness, had become symbols of the unknown, a reminder that some things in this world were simply beyond comprehension. And as the town of Auburn slowly began to close its doors to the past, it was clear that the legacy of the plantation would never truly fade. The mystery of the babies, and the dark secrets of the plantation, would linger forever, a silent terror haunting the town for years to come. As the investigation into the abandoned plantation and the eerie discovery of the white babies deepened, it became clear that the mystery surrounding the plantation's past was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Sheriff Ellis, Dr. Shaw, and the rest of the team felt increasingly helpless as they navigated a sea of conflicting evidence, strange occurrences, and unsubstantiated rumors. The more they uncovered, the more questions arose, and the deeper the investigation took them, the further they seemed to drift from any meaningful answers. The sense of unease was palpable, and the town began to fracture under the weight of uncertainty. In the early days of the investigation, law enforcement and medical experts had hoped that they could quickly piece together a rational explanation for the baby's presence in the abandoned cabins. They assumed that the children had been left behind by a desperate, perhaps mentally ill, woman who had sought refuge in the cabins long after the plantation had fallen into ruin. But as they combed through the cabins, taking inventory of every object, every piece of furniture, and every scrap of clothing, they found nothing that made sense. The babies weren't left in a hurry or by someone in distress, they had been arranged with a strange care that defied explanation. The cabins, long forgotten and nearly collapsed, had been disturbed in ways that suggested someone had been there recently, and with intent. The first witness to the strange scene was an elderly man named Eli, a local who had worked on the plantation in his youth. Eli had grown up with stories of the plantation's former owners, a family who had long since died off or left the area, but he had never spoken of any unusual occurrences at the time. But when he was asked about the cabin, something in his demeanor shifted. He hesitated before speaking, his voice faltering as though dredging up something he had long buried. "There's always been something off about that place," he murmured, staring at the ground as if looking for the right words. "I worked there, back when I was young. I don't think anyone ever really left. Not fully." He paused and looked over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to overhear. "We all knew to keep away from those cabins. Everyone did. But no one would tell you why. You just knew." Eli's cryptic comments stirred up a sense of dread that had been creeping through the town for days. What exactly was he trying to say? Was he hinting at some sort of dark history that had been hidden for generations? The sheriff and his team pressed him for more details, but the man refused to elaborate. His silence was more telling than his words. It was as though he feared what might happen if he said too much. It wasn't long before other locals, many of them elderly, began to open up about their own experiences with the plantation. They spoke of strange occurrences they'd witnessed over the years, of unexplained lights flickering in the windows of the abandoned mansion, of eerie sounds echoing through the trees at night. One woman, a former servant who had worked for the plantation owners, recounted an unsettling event from her childhood. "I was just a girl, maybe 7 or 8, she recalled, her voice shaky. "One night, I saw something. It was a figure, tall and dark. It was walking between the trees, its face hidden in the shadow. It wasn't like a normal person. I could feel it, even though I couldn't see it. I remember the air growing cold, like the life was being sucked out of the place." The woman paused and wiped a tear from her eye, a distant look in her gaze. "That's when I knew there was something evil on that land. Something that shouldn't be." The witnesses who had worked on the plantation, or had lived in the town during its prime, began to share similar stories, all of which painted a grim picture of the estate's history. It wasn't just a place where slavery had existed, or where a once thriving plantation had faltered with the end of the Civil War. It was a place steeped in something darker, something that had been quietly festering for generations. The stories were not always consistent, but the threads of fear and unease were undeniable. Everyone had their own version of the events, but one thing remained clear: the land was cursed. And the babies, with their unnatural calmness, their bizarre placement, and their haunting presence, were the latest manifestation of that curse. As the weeks passed, it became increasingly difficult to maintain a sense of rationality in the investigation. The team, once confident in their ability to uncover the truth, found themselves drawn into a world of superstition and folklore. The deeper they went, the more the lines between the real and the imagined began to blur. Sheriff Ellis, who had always prided himself on his skepticism, found himself increasingly disturbed by the strange developments. He began to question the motivations of his own officers, some of whom seemed to grow more reluctant with each passing day to venture anywhere near the plantation. Were they afraid? Or was there something more to fear than they could understand? The sheriff's own nightmares were becoming harder to ignore. He woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing echoes of whispers that seemed to come from all directions. The whispers never stopped, not even when he tried to close his eyes and force them out of his mind. They were always there, just beneath the surface of his thoughts. Sometimes he would hear a child crying, but when he opened his eyes, there would be no one there. It was as though the land itself was speaking to him, calling him to uncover something buried deep beneath its soil. Dr. Shaw, too, began to experience unsettling sensations as the investigation progressed. She was a woman of science, a woman who had spent her career studying the human body and its ailments, but now she found herself grappling with feelings she could not explain. Every time she returned to the plantation, the air seemed thicker, heavier. The house loomed larger, as though it were watching her, waiting. She began to feel that there was something alive in the walls, something that didn't want them to uncover its secrets. Her colleagues were not immune to the strange occurrences either. One evening, as the team gathered to review their findings, a large shadow passed over the room. At first, they all assumed it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a bird passing by the window. But when the shadow returned, moving in unnatural ways, everyone grew silent, staring at the walls. It was as if the very air had changed, thickened with an unspoken presence that they couldn't ignore. Despite the mounting unease, the team pushed forward with their investigation, determined to uncover the truth. They sifted through old records, piecing together fragments of the plantation's history. The more they learned about the plantation's former owners, the more they realized how little they actually knew. The family had kept to themselves, and while their wealth was well documented, their personal lives were shrouded in mystery. Few had known them well, and those who had were either dead or too afraid to speak. The only solid lead came from a dusty collection of old journals that had been found in the ruins of the main house. The journals, written by one of the plantation's former owners, chronicled his obsession with immortality and the idea of creating life. The entries were disturbing, filled with references to strange rituals and experiments. The more the investigators read, the more they began to understand the true nature of the plantation's history. The babies, left abandoned in the cabins, were not just victims of neglect or abandonment. They were the result of something far darker, something far more intentional. As they pored over the journals, it became clear that the former owner had believed in the power to manipulate life itself. The rituals, the symbols, the strange references to the bloodline, all pointed to a twisted attempt to control the very essence of existence. The family had not only been involved in the exploitation of human labor but had crossed into forbidden territory, dabbling in the realms of alchemy and necromancy. The babies, it seemed, were part of this perverse experiment, a horrific consequence of a family's long-held ambition to transcend the boundaries of life and death. But even with these revelations, the questions remained. Had these babies truly been the result of these experiments? If so, what was the purpose behind them? Why had they been left in such a manner? And who, if anyone, was responsible for the abominable legacy that had been hidden for so long? The more they uncovered, the more the line between reality and madness blurred, and it was becoming increasingly clear that this was not a story that could be easily explained away. The plantation, with all its darkness, was still hiding something, something that none of them were ready to confront. As the investigation spiraled into uncharted territory, one thing remained certain: the mystery of the babies was far from over. As the investigation stretched into weeks, a creeping sense of inevitability began to settle over the town of Auburn. The more the investigators tried to peel back the layers of history surrounding the plantation, the more elusive the truth became. It was as though the land itself had become a force to be reckoned with, resisting every attempt to uncover its secrets. The old plantation house, now nothing more than a decaying shell, seemed to mock their efforts, its broken windows staring like hollow eyes at the people who dared to trespass into its forgotten halls. Sheriff Ellis, once a man known for his level-headedness and practicality, began to change. He was no longer the skeptical officer who believed in logical explanations and simple answers. The evidence that had been uncovered, the strange placement of the babies, the eerie stillness in the abandoned cabins, the unsettling reports from the townspeople, had chipped away at his sense of certainty. He found himself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, haunted by dreams of the plantation and the babies who had been abandoned there. He would see their faces, pale and empty, staring at him from the dark corners of his mind. Sometimes, he would wake with the distinct feeling that someone, was watching him from the shadows. Dr. Shaw, too, found herself caught in a web of growing paranoia. The once rational medical examiner was now questioning the very foundation of her beliefs. The strange calmness of the babies, their unblinking eyes and unearthly stillness, had shaken her to the core. No scientific explanation seemed to fit, no medical theory could account for the bizarre preservation of their bodies. The more she studied the evidence, the more she realized that there were forces at play that defied her understanding of biology and the laws of nature. Her visits to the plantation had become increasingly disturbing. She would hear strange noises, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, always just on the edge of hearing. At times, she felt a cold presence at her back, as though someone, or something, was breathing down her neck, waiting for her to discover the truth. The growing fear in Auburn was not limited to the investigators. The townspeople, too, felt the pressure mounting. The discovery of the babies had unearthed a long-buried history, and the town was slowly being pulled into a past that it had long tried to forget. The plantation, once a symbol of decay and loss, had become a living nightmare, its dark legacy demanding attention. As rumors swirled, the townspeople grew increasingly superstitious. Some began to claim that the plantation was haunted, that the souls of the enslaved people who had worked the land were seeking revenge, and that the babies were the manifestation of a curse that had been placed on the land long ago. Old-timers who had lived in the town their entire lives spoke in hushed tones about the strange occurrences they had witnessed as children. They talked about the unsettling sounds that had echoed through the woods at night, about the flickering lights in the mansion's windows, and about the shadowy figures they had seen moving between the trees. They told stories of people who had gone missing, of things that had happened to those who had ventured too close to the plantation, things that could never be explained. One elderly man, his voice trembling, spoke of a night when he had seen a woman standing in the doorway of the mansion, her face obscured by a veil. He had been too afraid to approach her, but he would never forget the way she had looked at him, with eyes that seemed to see right through him. Despite their fears, the townspeople could not help but feel drawn to the plantation. The discovery of the babies had awakened something in them, a primal curiosity that was impossible to ignore. People began to gather outside the plantation gates, staring at the mansion with a mixture of fascination and dread. Some claimed that they had seen figures moving in the windows, shadows that seemed to pass by just out of sight. Others swore that they had heard the cries of babies in the distance, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. The more they tried to ignore it, the more the plantation seemed to pull them in, like a magnet drawing them closer to its heart of darkness. Meanwhile, the investigation continued, but the deeper they dug, the more the authorities found themselves tangled in a web of half-formed clues and bizarre theories. The journals that had been uncovered in the ruins of the mansion were filled with disturbing details, but they didn't provide a clear answer. The writings spoke of strange rituals, of the pursuit of immortality, and of attempts to manipulate the forces of life and death. But nothing in the journals explained the presence of the babies in the cabins. Was it possible that the former owners had been involved in dark, forbidden practices? Could they have been experimenting with life itself, creating children through some occult means? The investigators struggled to make sense of the conflicting information they had uncovered. Sheriff Ellis spent countless hours poring over the journals, trying to decipher their meaning. The more he read, the more he felt as though he were being drawn into a world that was beyond his comprehension. There were passages about rituals involving blood and sacrifice, about pacts made with forces from beyond the natural world. The former owner of the plantation, whose name appeared throughout the journals, seemed to have been obsessed with the idea of transcending death, of manipulating the cycle of life. The idea that the babies had been created through some dark, ritualistic means began to take root in Ellis's mind, though he was reluctant to fully accept it. It was around this time that a break in the case came from an unexpected source. One of the local historians, a man named Thomas Carter, came forward with an old family record that had been passed down through generations. Carter had spent years researching the history of Auburn and its surrounding area, and he had uncovered something that had been buried for decades. The record, which had once belonged to a former servant of the plantation, contained a detailed account of the plantation's decline after the Civil War. According to the document, there had been rumors of the family's involvement in occult practices long before the war had ended. The record mentioned strange ceremonies, including one that supposedly involved the birth of a child under unnatural circumstances, one that was said to be the result of an unholy pact made between the family and a mysterious figure. Carter's revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. The connection between the babies and the former owners of the plantation seemed undeniable. The more they learned, the more the pieces began to fit together. The babies were not the result of some random act of abandonment. They were part of something much larger, something far more sinister than anyone had dared to imagine. The former owners had been involved in something much darker than anyone had suspected. The plantation had been the site of horrific experiments, rituals designed to bring the dead back to life, to create life where none should have existed. And the babies, those pale, unblinking children found abandoned in the cabins, were the tragic results of these twisted experiments. The discovery left the investigators shaken, unsure of what to believe. They had uncovered a dark history that seemed to go beyond mere human cruelty. The plantation was not simply a place of exploitation, it was a place where the boundaries of life and death had been crossed in ways that defied reason. Sheriff Ellis, who had spent his life trying to bring order to chaos, now found himself standing at the edge of something he could not explain. The rational world he had once known seemed to be slipping away, replaced by something far more terrifying and unfathomable. As the investigation entered its final stages, the pressure on the town of Auburn grew unbearable. The plantation, once a distant memory, had become a living nightmare. The town was being pulled into a past it could not escape. The dark legacy of the plantation's former owners had been unearthed, and with it came the realization that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. The truth about the babies, about the experiments and rituals that had taken place on that land, would never be fully understood. And the shadow of the plantation would continue to hang over the town, a reminder that some things should remain buried, no matter how much one may wish to forget. The weeks following the discovery of the white babies in the cabins felt like a slow descent into madness for Auburn. The town, which had once been so quiet and predictable, had become a place defined by unease. The plantation, a long-abandoned relic of history, was now the center of whispered conversations, fearful glances, and an overwhelming sense that something malevolent still lingered in its decaying walls. The mystery of the babies, combined with the mounting reports of strange occurrences, began to erode the fabric of the town's collective psyche. As the investigation continued, more and more residents began to openly question the very nature of reality itself. What had truly happened at the plantation? And how much of what they thought they knew about the past was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie? The air seemed heavy with unspoken fears, and the once ordinary rhythms of life were disrupted by the terrifying thought that the past might not be something that could simply be buried. The land, with its twisted history, was beginning to speak again, and the townspeople were listening with growing dread. Sheriff Ellis, the man who had once been the calm, rational center of the investigation, was beginning to crack. He had never believed in the supernatural. He had grown up in a world where everything had an explanation, where crime and tragedy could always be understood through logic, through facts. But the more time he spent at the plantation, the more the world he knew seemed to fall apart. The babies, those strange, still children who had been found abandoned in the cabins, had unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. Their unnatural calmness, their eerie stillness, seemed to mock the rational world he had always relied on. As he revisited the plantation grounds, each trip felt more oppressive than the last. The air, thick with the scent of rotting wood and moss, weighed down on him, as though the land itself was pressing against him. The once proud mansion now appeared as a dark, hollow monument to something unspeakable, a grim reminder of what had transpired there. The house, with its shattered windows and crumbling facade, was like a wound that had never healed, a wound that refused to close, no matter how much time had passed. And the land around it, the overgrown fields, the twisted trees, the dense thickets that had once been carefully manicured gardens, seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though the very earth beneath his feet had absorbed something dark, something dangerous. Dr. Shaw, too, found herself caught in a spiral of confusion and fear. The more she tried to rationalize the events, the more the facts seemed to slip away from her grasp. She had spent her life studying the human body, understanding its intricacies and complexities, but the discovery of the babies had forced her to confront the possibility that there were forces in the world that science could not explain. Her visits to the plantation, once routine, had become increasingly unsettling. Every step she took on the land seemed to trigger a deep, primal response within her. She began to experience vivid dreams, dreams of the plantation, of the babies, and of strange figures that loomed just beyond her sight. These dreams were never simple, they were filled with symbolism, with cryptic imagery that seemed to defy all logical interpretation. She saw images of the plantation's former owners, their faces obscured by shadows, performing rituals in the dead of night. She saw the babies again, their glassy eyes fixed on her, their silent faces haunting her even in her waking hours. And she saw the land, twisting and shifting, as though it were alive, as though it were trying to communicate something to her. The dreams were becoming more frequent, more vivid, and more impossible to ignore. Dr. Shaw began to wonder whether the visions were just a product of her own mind, or whether the land itself was trying to reveal something to her, something she was not ready to understand. The pressure on the town mounted with each passing day. More and more people began to speak of the strange happenings they had experienced. Some reported seeing figures in the woods at night, moving silently between the trees. Others spoke of lights flickering in the windows of the plantation house, though no one lived there. The townspeople were terrified, but at the same time, they were drawn to the plantation, as though it had become a magnet for their fears and their curiosity. The stories of the plantation's dark past, once dismissed as mere folklore, were now viewed in a new, much more sinister light. Some spoke of hearing voices, faint whispers that seemed to drift on the wind, while others claimed they had seen children playing in the yard late at night. The children were always seen from a distance, just beyond the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. But when anyone approached, the children vanished, leaving only the chill of the night air in their wake. A sense of something watching, waiting, began to permeate every corner of the town. The land was not simply haunted, it was alive, and it was watching. The growing fear was not just confined to the town's residents. The investigators, too, found themselves growing more and more uneasy with each passing day. Sheriff Ellis, Dr. Shaw, and the rest of the team could feel the weight of the past pressing down on them, a heavy burden that seemed impossible to shake. They began to question their own motives. Were they simply trying to solve a crime, to bring closure to the mystery? Or had they become part of something much larger, something far darker than they could comprehend? The deeper they delved into the history of the plantation, the more the lines between the living and the dead began to blur. The former owners of the plantation had been involved in occult practices, of that much they were certain. The journals they had found in the ruins of the mansion spoke of rituals, of attempts to transcend the boundaries of life and death. But the more they read, the more it became clear that the family had been consumed by their obsession with immortality. They had gone to great lengths to manipulate life itself, to control the forces of nature in ways that had never been meant to be understood. It was as though they had sought to harness the very essence of existence, only to find that in doing so, they had unleashed something far more powerful and dangerous than they had ever imagined. The babies, it seemed, were not simply victims of neglect. They were part of a twisted experiment, the result of the family's unholy attempts to manipulate the natural order. The children, with their lifeless eyes and unnatural stillness, were the products of this perverse quest for immortality, creatures born of darkness, left behind on the land as a reminder of the family's hubris and their eventual downfall. The thought of it was almost too much to bear, and yet, as the investigators pieced together the horrifying truth, they found themselves drawn deeper into the web of mystery and fear. As the investigation reached its boiling point, Sheriff Ellis found himself standing at a crossroads. He had spent his life chasing down criminals, bringing justice to those who had been wronged. But this case, this mystery, was beyond anything he had ever faced. It was not a crime in the traditional sense. It was not a simple matter of right and wrong. It was a reminder of the dark, hidden forces that lurked just beneath the surface of reality, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And now, it seemed, the time had come. The deeper the investigation went, the more the investigators found themselves entangled in the web of the plantation's cursed past. The mystery of the babies, the whispers of occult rituals, and the strange occurrences that surrounded the plantation had all merged into something far greater than they had ever imagined. They had uncovered a dark, ancient force that had been lying dormant for generations, waiting for the right time to awaken. But even as they neared the truth, they realized that some questions were not meant to be answered. The plantation, with all its dark history, was a place that defied understanding. The land was cursed, the former owners had made pacts with powers beyond this world, and the babies, those tragic, haunting figures, were the result of a legacy that could never be erased. The truth, once uncovered, was far more terrifying than they could have ever anticipated. And as Sheriff Ellis stood on the grounds of the plantation, looking out at the land that had once been the site of such wealth and power, he realized that the town of Auburn would never be the same again. The past had come alive, and it would not let them go. As the weeks dragged on, the investigation into the eerie discovery of the white babies in the plantation cabins seemed to stagnate. The more Sheriff Ellis, Dr. Shaw, and the rest of the team dug into the history of the land, the more the truth slipped through their fingers. The old records, the journals, the strange testimonies from local witnesses, they all pointed to something far darker than any of them had been prepared to confront. The plantation, with its crumbling walls and overgrown grounds, had become a graveyard for both the past and the present. The deeper they went, the more the mystery of the babies felt like a riddle that could never be solved. It was as though the land itself had swallowed the answers, leaving only confusion and fear in its wake. The town of Auburn, once a quiet, ordinary place, was now defined by an undercurrent of tension that rippled through every conversation, every glance. The discovery of the babies had peeled back a layer of history that no one had ever truly wanted to uncover. The plantation was no longer just a decaying relic of the past, it had become a living nightmare, its dark legacy pulling the townspeople into its gravitational pull. People began to avoid speaking of it openly, as though simply mentioning it might invite the same darkness that had been unleashed upon them. Sheriff Ellis, for his part, found himself trapped in a personal struggle that mirrored the growing unease in the town. The man who had once prided himself on his rationality, who had always trusted in evidence and facts, was now haunted by his inability to explain what had happened at the plantation. Every time he revisited the site, the weight of the past seemed to press down harder on his chest. The oppressive silence of the plantation seemed to seep into his bones. The air around the mansion felt thick, charged with something ancient, something that refused to be forgotten. Ellis's sleep was plagued with dreams of the babies, their glassy eyes locked onto his, their silent faces twisted in expressions he couldn't place. He would find himself standing in the middle of the abandoned plantation house, hearing the faintest of whispers, too soft to understand but impossible to ignore. The voices would echo through the hallways, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was as though the house itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to uncover the secrets it had held for so long. In the mornings, Ellis would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, his mind struggling to shake off the vivid images of his nightmares. Dr. Shaw was no better off. The more she studied the babies, the more unsettled she became. The medical examiner had seen her fair share of grotesque cases, but nothing like this. The babies had been left in a state of unnatural preservation, their bodies perfectly intact despite the decay that surrounded them. It was as though they had been placed there deliberately, left in that forsaken place for reasons that defied all logic. The lack of any discernible cause of death only deepened the mystery. What kind of person, what kind of force, could have left them there like that? And why? Every visit to the plantation left Dr. Shaw feeling increasingly disturbed. The land seemed to react to her presence, as though it recognized that she was trying to unearth its secrets. The very air around her seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier, with each step she took onto the property. The strange occurrences grew more frequent, faint voices, fleeting shadows, whispers that echoed just behind her. She couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize the sense of something watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. The fear that had gripped the town now seemed to be closing in on her, too, tightening its hold with every passing day. But it wasn't just the investigation that was beginning to unravel the town. The atmosphere in Auburn had shifted completely. People no longer greeted each other in the same way. There was an air of suspicion, of wariness, that hung over every interaction. The town, once close-knit and small, was now divided. Some were desperate for answers, for closure, while others, particularly the older residents, were more than happy to turn a blind eye and pretend the past could be forgotten. The younger generation, however, found themselves drawn to the mystery. They were curious, intrigued by the stories that had long been whispered in the town but never fully examined. The children, too, had begun to act differently. They would stare at the plantation house with an unsettling intensity, as though they could feel something there that the adults could not. Some claimed to hear children's laughter on the wind late at night, distant but clear, as though the house was calling to them. Others spoke of seeing figures move between the trees, their outlines too vague to make out, but the sense of something lurking in the darkness was impossible to ignore. A strange fever of curiosity had swept through Auburn, and while some tried to ignore it, others embraced it. Groups of teenagers would gather outside the plantation gates, daring each other to venture closer, to see what they could discover. They would sneak into the woods at night, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of fear and excitement, and come back with stories of the things they had seen or heard. One boy claimed he had seen a woman standing in the window of the mansion, her face obscured by a veil, but when he approached, the figure vanished. Another girl swore she had heard the cries of babies in the night, carried on the wind from deep within the plantation. The investigators, for their part, tried to stay focused on the case, but they were constantly being distracted by the growing rumors and the strange phenomena that seemed to be taking over the town. Every time they thought they had a lead, something else would come up, another bizarre witness report, another strange occurrence that no one could explain. They were no longer certain what was real and what was simply a product of the town's mounting hysteria. Sheriff Ellis began to question whether the people were being affected by the energy of the land itself. Was the plantation's past so dark, so deeply ingrained in the soil, that it was now leaking into the present? Was the land somehow warping the minds of those who came into contact with it? It was impossible to ignore the rising tide of superstition that had taken root in the town. Some of the older townsfolk, who had been around long enough to remember the plantation's glory days, began to speak more openly of the rituals that had supposedly taken place on the property. They whispered of strange ceremonies that had been held in the dead of night, of rituals that involved blood and sacrifice. The younger generation scoffed at these stories, dismissing them as fanciful legends, but as the mysteries around the plantation deepened, they began to wonder if there was some truth to the tales after all. In the midst of this growing panic, a man named Charles Williams, a local historian who had long been fascinated by the plantation, came forward with a startling revelation. Williams had spent years combing through old records, seeking to understand the legacy of the plantation and its former owners. He had always believed there was something more to the family's history, something that had been deliberately erased from the town's collective memory. What he uncovered, however, was more terrifying than anything he had imagined. The plantation's former owners, he discovered, had not only been involved in occult practices, but they had been actively trying to harness the power of life and death. Williams uncovered journals, letters, and accounts from long-dead servants who spoke of rituals designed to manipulate the very fabric of life. The former plantation owners had been obsessed with immortality, with creating life where there should have been none. The babies, it seemed, were not just the victims of an abandoned land, they were the result of twisted experiments, the product of an unnatural desire to control the forces of life and death. Williams presented his findings to the sheriff and Dr. Shaw, and they were shaken by the implications of what he had uncovered. The babies were not abandoned by chance. They were the consequence of a dark obsession, a desire to transcend the natural order. And they were not the first victims. The land, it seemed, had been steeped in death long before the Civil War, long before the plantation had fallen into disrepair. The family's experiments had been ongoing for generations, leaving behind a legacy of suffering and dark magic that had never truly been laid to rest. The more the investigation uncovered, the clearer it became that the truth of the plantation's past was too monstrous to fully comprehend. Sheriff Ellis and Dr. Shaw began to realize that some mysteries were never meant to be solved. The plantation, with its history of death, darkness, and unnatural experimentation, was a place where the boundaries between life and death had been permanently erased. The babies, with their unnatural stillness, their eerie calm, were only the latest manifestation of a history that had refused to remain buried. As the investigation reached its climax, Sheriff Ellis stood at the edge of the plantation grounds, staring at the crumbling house. The land, once vibrant with life, now felt like a tomb, a place where the past had been trapped, a place where the echoes of dark rituals still lingered, waiting for someone to listen. And as the wind rustled through the trees, Ellis couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The plantation, in all its decrepitude, was not just a relic of the past, it was a presence, a force that still demanded attention. And it wasn't done yet. As the investigation began to slow, the oppressive atmosphere in Auburn only seemed to grow more intense. Sheriff Ellis and Dr. Shaw, once determined to uncover the truth behind the haunting discovery of the white babies, were now trapped in a cycle of questions that seemed impossible to answer. Their investigation had peeled back layers of history, exposing truths that had been buried for generations, yet each new discovery only deepened the mystery. The more they learned, the more they realized they had only scratched the surface of something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. The town itself had begun to feel like a place under siege. It was no longer just a small, quiet community, it was a town haunted by its past, suffocated by its own fears and anxieties. The once familiar faces of the townspeople had started to change. There was an edge of suspicion in every interaction, a palpable fear that seemed to hang in the air like an invisible fog. People had started avoiding the area around the plantation, as if merely being near it might be enough to invite the same dark forces that had long been at work there. No one dared speak openly about the plantation anymore, as if doing so would somehow unleash the very things they feared most. The presence of the plantation had begun to permeate every corner of life in Auburn. For many, it had become a symbol of the town's darkest secrets, a place where the line between the living and the dead had been blurred, where the unnatural forces that had been manipulated and tampered with had left behind a legacy of suffering and fear. The babies, abandoned in the cabins, were no longer just tragic victims of neglect. They were the physical manifestation of something darker, something far more insidious. They were the product of experiments that sought to twist the natural order, to defy life and death. And in their silent, eerie stillness, they had become symbols of a curse that had taken hold of the land itself. Sheriff Ellis, exhausted and increasingly paranoid, found himself retreating deeper into his thoughts. The rational, clear-headed man he once was seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a figure who could no longer trust his own senses. Every time he revisited the plantation, he felt as though the land was closing in on him. The silence of the mansion seemed to mock him, the faint creaking of its decaying bones whispering things he couldn't quite grasp. The wind through the trees now seemed to carry a warning, and even the smallest noises, birds chirping, leaves rustling, felt like they were trying to tell him something he was too afraid to understand. The once crisp air of the mornings felt heavy, thick, as though it was charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Ellis began to feel as though he were being drawn into the very darkness he was trying to uncover. He had always believed that his job was to restore order, to bring justice and understanding to situations clouded by fear and uncertainty. But now, it seemed that every step forward only took him deeper into a world where logic and reason no longer applied. He could feel the creeping weight of something intangible pressing down on him, something he could neither see nor touch, but something that was undeniably real. It was as though the plantation itself was watching him, waiting for him to give in to its pull. Dr. Shaw, too, was becoming increasingly disoriented. Her once clear scientific mind, which had been grounded in years of medical training and rational thought, was now clouded by uncertainty. The babies, their bodies unnaturally preserved, refused to fit into any medical framework she was familiar with. She had tried everything, X-rays, autopsies, blood tests, but nothing explained the bizarre state of the bodies. No signs of trauma, no apparent cause of death, just lifelessness so complete that it seemed to defy nature. She found herself returning to the plantation over and over, hoping that with each visit, the answers would finally reveal themselves. But each time, the mystery deepened, and she found herself further ensnared in a web she couldn't escape. It wasn't just the babies that haunted her. It was the land itself, the plantation house, the very air that hung thick and oppressive in her lungs. As she wandered through the decaying halls of the mansion, she would often feel an odd sensation in the back of her mind, as though she were being watched. The sound of her footsteps would echo through the empty rooms, only to be followed by an almost imperceptible sound, a faint rustling, like whispers of something, someone, just out of sight. She had tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as her imagination, but the longer she stayed, the more convinced she became that something, some presence, was watching her, waiting for her to uncover the truth. The sense of unease in Auburn had reached a fever pitch. Residents, already on edge from the discovery of the babies, began to speak more openly of the strange occurrences they had witnessed over the years. Whispers of the plantation's cursed history circulated like wildfire. Stories of mysterious figures in the windows of the mansion, of shadowy shapes moving in the trees, of strange lights flickering in the night. The most unsettling stories, however, were the ones involving the children, the ones who had supposedly vanished into the woods or disappeared from sight altogether, only to be seen again in strange places, always watching, always waiting. The children of Auburn were not exempt from the strange happenings. They began to act differently, more distant, as though they too could sense the shift in the air. Some children claimed to hear the sounds of babies crying in the night, their wails carried on the wind from the direction of the plantation. Others spoke of seeing children playing in the yard of the mansion, their faces pale and their movements jerky, as though they were not quite human. The most disturbing stories came from the younger teenagers, who began to venture closer to the plantation at night, drawn by the fear and curiosity that gripped the town. They would return with tales of things they had seen, figures in the windows, shadows moving in the trees, a woman in a white dress standing at the top of the stairs. Despite the mounting fear, a strange pull seemed to draw them back, and the legend of the plantation grew with each passing day. The idea that the land itself was alive, that the house had been the site of some kind of dark power, was no longer just a theory. It was a belief, a collective understanding that had taken hold of the town's consciousness. And the more the townspeople believed, the more the town itself began to change. The past had come alive, and it was clear that it was not finished with Auburn. Sheriff Ellis and Dr. Shaw tried to stay focused on the case, but the escalating hysteria made it increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction. The lines between reality and superstition were blurring, and the more they dug into the history of the plantation, the more they realized that they might never find the answers they sought. It seemed as though the truth was elusive, slipping away from them with each new discovery. They had uncovered dark rituals, twisted experiments, and long-forgotten pacts made with forces beyond understanding, but none of it seemed to explain the central mystery, the babies. It was then that they stumbled upon a document buried deep within the plantation's records. It was an old letter, yellowed and crumbling with age, written by one of the plantation's original owners. The letter spoke of the family's obsession with immortality, of their belief that they could create life, control life, and ultimately cheat death. The letter hinted at experiments that had taken place in the hidden rooms of the mansion, dark rituals performed under the cover of night, sacrifices made in an attempt to transcend the human condition. The former owner spoke of a final experiment, one that would prove their theories once and for all, one that would leave a mark on the land for all eternity. As Ellis and Shaw read the letter, a chilling realization began to settle over them. The family had succeeded in their experiments, they had created life. But they had not anticipated the consequences. The babies, left abandoned in the cabins, were the byproducts of those dark rituals. They were not mere victims of neglect, they were the unintended results of an ancient, forbidden process, one that had twisted the natural order and left behind something unnatural, something that defied explanation. The truth, it seemed, was worse than they had feared. The plantation was not just the site of human suffering, it was a place where the very fabric of life and death had been torn asunder, where science and the supernatural had collided in a grotesque and terrifying way. The babies were not born of nature, they were born of something darker, something that could never be understood, something that the land itself had absorbed. The realization left Ellis and Shaw in a state of stunned silence. They had uncovered the truth, but it was a truth that defied all comprehension. The past could not be undone, and the curse of the plantation could never be lifted. The land had been tainted by the experiments of the family who had once lived there, and it was clear that the darkness they had unleashed would never be fully contained. The town of Auburn had been irrevocably changed. It was no longer a quiet, peaceful place, it was a town haunted by its past, by the ghosts of experiments that had crossed the line between life and death. And as the investigators stood there, looking out at the decaying mansion, they knew that the plantation's legacy would live on forever, in ways they could never have imagined.